Let's see how quickly we can cover everything you need to know for AQA Biology Paper 2. This video is good for higher and foundation tier, double, combined trilogy, and triple or separate biology. That is topics 5 to 7. That's homeostasis and response, inheritance, variation and evolution, and ecology. I'll tell you when something is just for triple, but not when something is just for higher tier, because there's not much difference, to be honest. We're going to be moving heckin' fast, so pause the video if you need a bit more time to get your head around something you see. Let's go. Homeostasis is the term given to an organism's ability to regulate internal conditions, even when external conditions change. This is important so that crucial chemical reactions involving enzymes can happen at an optimum rate. Amongst other things, our bodies work hard to regulate blood glucose concentration, temperature, and water levels, for example. One way that our body achieves this is with our nervous system. It consists of the CNS, that's central nervous system, that's the brain and spinal cord, and the PNS, peripheral nervous system, the nerves that go through the rest of the body. A receptor, for example skin, detects a change due to a stimulus, like a hot hob. An electrical signal travels to the spine through sensory and relay neurons, nerve cells. The signal travels across the gap between these neurons, called the synapse, by a neurotransmitter chemical. Once at the spine, the signal can go to the brain where you can make the conscious decision to act. The signal then goes back to an effector, like the muscle in your arm, via relay and motor neurons so that you move your arm. A reflex is when the signal bypasses the brain and goes straight through the spine to the effector. This is a reflex arc. This, of course, is much faster than a conscious decision. Glands can also be effectors, which produce specific chemicals your body needs depending on the situation. For example, your salivary glands in your mouth making saliva when you eat food. You can investigate into reaction times by holding the bottom of a ruler between a person's finger and thumb and drop it without warning. Then you measure the distance it falls before they catch it. Do this multiple times and take a mean average. Not too many times though, as their nervous systems will start to get a bit better at reacting to this. You can introduce an independent variable like a stimulant, for example coffee or a sugary drink, or a depressant which will have the opposite effect, although I can't think of any ones that are legal for you at the minute, to see how they decrease or increase reaction time respectively. You could calculate the reaction time from the distance using SUVAT, S equals half 80 squared, but you'll never be expected to do that in this paper, but it's something you could mention if you were asked a 6 marker on this. Back to double science goodness, which is for everyone. The endocrine system is a system of glands that produce or secrete hormones that travel to effectors via the blood. This is of course slower than any signal carried by the nervous system. The pituitary gland in your brain can be considered the main or master gland, as it produces hormones in response to stimuli that travel to other glands in your body in order that they start then producing certain chemicals. Examples are the pancreas, which produces insulin. We'll talk more about that in a bit. The thyroid controls all sorts of things like growth, heart muscle and digestive function, and more. The adrenal glands produce adrenaline, and the ovaries and testes release eggs or produce sperm, depending on which you have. Speaking of the pancreas then, it's involved in making sure that your blood glucose levels aren't too high or too low. Too high and the pancreas secretes insulin, which causes glucose to move from the blood into your cells to be used for respiration. Any excess glucose can be converted into glycogen to store energy, and that's done by the liver. Too low on the other hand, and the pancreas produces another hormone called glucagon, which causes the liver and muscles to turn glycogen back into glucose ready to be used. Type 1 diabetes is what you have when your pancreas can't produce enough insulin, and you have to take insulin injections to do the job instead. Type 2 is when your cells no longer absorb the glucose as they should, so you have to be careful with your diet, and if you're overweight or obese, you have a much higher risk of developing this. But everybody, well, you know what I mean. Menstruation occurs in females. After puberty, eggs start to mature. First, FSH, that's follicle stimulating hormone made by the pituitary gland, causes an egg to mature in the ovary. This also causes the ovaries to produce estrogen, which causes the uterus lining to thicken. It also inhibits or stops the production of FSH so that no more eggs mature in that cycle. Very clever. It also causes the pituitary gland to produce LH, luteinizing hormone, which causes the egg to be released and it starts to travel towards the uterus via the oviduct over several days. Finally, progesterone is also produced by the ovaries, which maintains the uterus lining. This is great news if you're looking to get pregnant. If not, you need to find some way of stopping a sperm cell meeting an egg cell. Contraception options include pills that inhibit FSH production so no eggs mature, progesterone injections that stop any eggs being released. You can also have an implant that slowly releases this over months or years if needed. Condoms for men and diaphragms for women are simple barriers to stop sperm from reaching an egg. An IUD or intrauterine device like a copper coil prevents a fertilized egg from implanting in the lining. You could quite simply just avoid sex for some time after the egg has been released, as that's when it travels slowly down the oviduct where a sperm can meet it. Clamping the oviduct sometimes refers to having your tubes tied or cutting the sperm ducts. Either of these will obviously stop these cells meeting. Some couples, however, would love to have children but can't due to infertility. Sometimes it's something fairly simple like not enough FSH or LH produced, which injections can fix. The most expensive solution to bigger issues is IVF, in vitro fertilization. Eggs are harvested from the woman after inducing their release and are then fertilized in the lab with the prospective father's sperm. Any embryos that develop are inserted back into the uterus, where they will hopefully embed in the lining and grow normally. The success rate, however, is very low, but there is also the risk that there could be more than one baby born, which might not be desirable. I've already mentioned it, adrenaline is the hormone that increases heart and breathing rate in stressful situations to prepare the body for fight or flight. Thyroxine is another hormone that's secreted by the thyroid, and it controls metabolic rate. If thyroxine levels are too low, the hypothalamus in your brain releases a hormone called TRH, you don't need to know the full name, and that causes the pituitary gland to produce another hormone called TSH, so the thyroid releases more thyroxine. This again is an example of negative feedback. Topic B6, that's inheritance, variation and evolution. In order to reproduce sexually, gametes, sex cells, must be made. This happens by meiosis, for example in the testes to make sperm. The chromosomes in a diploid cell, that is 23 pairs for us, are copied, similar chromosomes then pair up and the genes are swapped between them. The cell then divides to make two diploid cells, which then divide again, along with the chromosomes themselves, to make 4 haploid cells, ready to fuse with another gamete, which in this case would be an egg. This is one way that variation occurs in offspring. The resulting diploid cell then starts to divide via mitosis, which is covered in paper 1. Plants do this with pollen and egg cells, but they can also reproduce asexually. But as it doesn't involve gametes, the daughter cells will be genetically identical, so a clone of the parent is made by mitosis. An advantage of sexual reproduction is that variation occurs, which can result in organisms becoming better suited to their environment, more on this in a bit, so more likely to survive. An advantage for asexual is that only one parent is needed, so for example a plant on its lonesome can still reproduce in order for the species to survive. Another thing that can do both is the parasite that causes malaria, as can some fungi. Genome is the term given to all the genetic material in an organism. This code is stored in DNA, of course, which is a 2-stranded polymer in a double helix shape. A gene is a section of DNA that codes for a specific protein. The Human Genome Project completed its initial goal in 2003 when scientists mapped out what every gene is responsible for coding. This is powerful because it can help us identify what genes cause diseases or inherited disorders. Genotype is the term given to what code is stored in your DNA specifically, while phenotype is how that code is expressed in your characteristics, what proteins are made. It affects your physiology. For triple, you need to know that the monomers between the two strands are called nucleotides, and they're made from a sugar and phosphate group, of which there are 4 types: A, T, C, and G. You don't need to know what the names are, but A and T always match to each other in the sequence, as do C and G. Every 3 of these bases, we can call them, are a code for an amino acid. The sequence is copied by mRNA. This copy is then taken out of the nucleus to a ribosome in the cell, where amino acids are connected in the order needed, which makes a protein, the shape of which affects its function. They need to be folded as well first. Harmful mutations can change a gene so much that it results in a protein being synthesized that doesn't do the job it's supposed to. We now know that some DNA, however, doesn't directly code for proteins, but it influences how other genes are expressed. This is the realm of epigenetics, and it's changing the way that we view DNA quite drastically. Back to double, some characteristics are controlled by just one gene, like color blindness. These different types of the same gene are called alleles. Usually, characteristics are dependent on 2 or more genes though, and them interacting. Dominant alleles are those that result in a characteristic being expressed even if there is another allele present, a recessive allele. For example, if you have the alleles big B, little b for eye color, big B being brown, little b being blue, you will have brown eyes. It's only when there's no dominant allele in this case that the recessive allele is expressed. So, me having blue eyes, I must have the gene little b. Big B or little b are called homozygous, as they only have one type of allele, whereas big B is what we call heterozygous. We can use a Punnett square to predict the probability of a certain phenotype. My parents have brown eyes, but they both have heterozygous alleles for eye colour. There are 3 different outcomes of these combining, with a 25% chance of making me. That's little b. So I'm not so much 1 in a million, more 1 in 4. My sister has brown eyes, but her son has blue eyes, so she must be big B. Eye colour is by the by, but some alleles can result in disorders being inherited. For example, polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, which is caused by a dominant allele, or cystic fibrosis, which is caused by a recessive allele. Even if 2 parents don't have cystic fibrosis, they could still be carrying the recessive allele, so their child could have the disorder. Human DNA is contained in 23 pairs of chromosomes, but only 1 pair determines sex. If you have XX chromosomes, you are female, XY, you're male. The expression of these genes affects every cell in your body, every aspect of your physiology. We can also make a Punnett square for these. As you can see, there's a 50-50 chance of the child being male or female. Variation is a result of the genes inherited from an organism's parents and also environmental factors. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution states that random variation in offspring will result in some being better suited to their environment than others, and so are more likely to survive and reproduce. But like we've seen, we know that our DNA is able to respond to the environment in order to turn genes on and off, depending on whether they're needed or not. For example, there were some blind, translucent skinned mackerel that were found in a dark cave. When they were bred with normal mackerel in sunlight, they regained fully working eyes and opaque skin within a few generations. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory asserted that adaptation of variation is guided by DNA in response to a changing environment. This was scoffed at, but we now know that there is some truth to this, thanks to the discoveries made in epigenetics. Bacterial resistance is largely considered to be evidence of Darwinian evolution. Bacteria divide, mutations occur, and inevitably a bacterium with an increased resistance to antibiotics will be produced. That's why we only want to use them when absolutely necessary. It also means you have to complete the whole course of antibiotics. If you don't, weaker bacteria will have been killed off, but more resistant ones will still be there, and then they'll reproduce and make you even more ill. If organisms are able to produce fertile offspring, we say they're of the same species. Tigers and lions have been known to make liger offspring, but as they're infertile, we don't consider tigers and lions to be the same species. We can selectively breed living things with desired characteristics to enhance these. For example, breeding dogs to produce breeds like Labradors, Collies, and if you're into undesirable characteristics, pugs too. Advancements in biology over the last few decades mean that we can also genetically modify organisms if we don't want to wait for selective breeding to do the job, or when it can't actually achieve what we want it to, for good or ill. For example, scientists have genetically modified bacteria to produce insulin, which can be harvested and used to treat people with diabetes. Genetically modifying crops is one way of boosting their yields or nutritional value. For example, golden rice has a gene inserted into it that produces vitamin A. It was developed to combat diets in certain areas that were lacking in this. Other GM crops have been modified to be more resistant to diseases, for example. The process of genetic engineering goes as follows. A gene is chemically cut from the organism that has the desired characteristic. This is done using enzymes. For example, the gene from a jellyfish that causes it to glow in the dark. This is then inserted into a vector, like a bacteria, plasmid, or virus. That in turn inserts the gene into another organism, say a bunny rabbit. But it must be done in the early stage of its development, say just after the egg has been fertilized, as this is the only way you can be sure that the gene will be present in every cell of the bunny as it grows. By the way, I didn't make up this example, this has actually been done. Fossils are the remains of organisms that died a very long time ago. The classic fossils we think about are the bones that we dig up, but they're not strictly speaking bones anymore. In fact, minerals have replaced the organic material to effectively leave rock in exactly the same shape as the bone. Sometimes there can still be organic tissue left behind if the conditions for decay are not present. Footprints left in mud that have hardened over time, for example, are also considered fossils, as well as any other trace of an organism. It doesn't have to be the organism itself. Carl Linnaeus classified organisms into kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. A good mnemonic for this is King Philip came over for good soup. The binomial, a Latin name for an organism, is just the genus and species combined. As time went on, it turned out that another level above kingdom was needed. Domain. The three domains are archaea, that's primitive bacteria, normal or true bacteria, and eukaryota. That's everything else, of course, with DNA and the nucleus of the cells. You should know about eukaryotic cells from paper 1. Archaea, by the way, are often found in extreme environments on the Earth. They can therefore be called extremophiles. Final big topic, ecology, is the study of how lots of organisms interact in an ecosystem. Organisms generally compete for food, water, space, and other things like CO2 and light for plants, shelter and mates for animals. Interdependence is the term given to the fact that organisms can rely on each other for these things, and they can form a community. Abiotic factors in an ecosystem are the non-living aspects, for example, light, temperature, moisture, soil pH, CO2 and O2 levels in the air. Biotic factors are due to organisms and things like food that's available, predators prey around, other organisms, pathogens, breeding behavior, and more. We can use quadrats to estimate the size of a population of an organism in a certain area by sampling around, say, 10% of the area, taking a mean, and then multiplying up for the whole area. Using a quadrat with a transect allows us to observe how population distribution changes over a distance. The food chain shows the direction that biomass, and therefore energy, flows in an ecosystem from one organism to another. Producers are any organism that uses sunlight to produce biomass. That's usually plants or algae. Primary consumers eat the producers, herbivores that eat only plants or omnivores that eat both meat and plants. Then predators known as secondary consumers, that could be carnivores or omnivores, they prey on them, and then we can have tertiary consumers as well. Apex predators are those at the top of the food chain. They have no natural predator above them. These levels are called trophic levels, by the way. The population numbers of all of these will fluctuate in an ecosystem over time. By the way, this food chain is possible. I looked it up. Bears do eat foxes. All life is carbon-based, which means that when organisms die, the carbon is recycled, which ultimately can be used to make more organisms. One way, of course, is when CO2 is produced, which plants then use to grow. Bacteria also release CO2 when an organism undergoes decomposition. Water follows a cycle. Rain falls, then runs into rivers, into the sea, then it's evaporated, and the cycle continues. For triple, you need to know that farmers utilize decomposition to produce natural fertilizers that can then be used on crops. It can also be used to produce methane gas to be used as fuel. Back to double. Biodiversity is one of those buzzwords that's very much in vogue at the minute. Basically, it means how many different types of organisms you have in an ecosystem. High biodiversity generally makes for a stable ecosystem, as organisms don't have to depend on one species for a resource, for example. Sadly, human development usually results in lower biodiversity. This development also poses problems when it comes to waste. We're having to find more ways of disposing of sewage, fertilizers, toxic chemicals, atmospheric pollution, and more to reduce our impact on the environment. One factor is the land that we need for building, quarrying, farming, and disposing of waste. An example of this is the destruction of peat bogs to make compost, which affects the habitat of many organisms and microorganisms. Burning peat also releases CO2. Now, going off piste for a second, for your exams you need to say that carbon dioxide and methane contribute to global warming. Deforestation, bad on a big scale. Flattening forests reduces biodiversity, and it's often done to create farmland. The pyramid of biomass is a food chain that shows us how much mass enters the next trophic level, relatively. You need to be able to draw one on graph paper using numbers supplied in the question, and also calculate the percentage absorbed by the next level. As per usual, percentage is equal to the bit divided by the lot times 100. Of course, this shows that biomass is lost at each level, because it's not just a rectangle, as not all biomass is absorbed or consumed into the next organism. Some is lost due to the organisms living for some time before being eaten by a predator, for example. It's also lost as water, urea, and CO2. Food security is a big thing, especially in these uncertain days. Food is becoming more scarce due to increasing world population, changing diets, food being transported around the world, which requires huge amounts of energy, changing growing environments, the cost of farming, that's a big one at the minute, and conflicts. For example, around 40% of the world's wheat comes from Ukraine, or at least it used to. Farmers are constantly trying to find more efficient ways of farming, largely by maximizing biomass input to crops and animals, while also reducing biomass lost by them. Fishing sustainably is also important. If a species is fished at a greater rate than it's breeding, then its population can disappear in those areas. One way of sustainably fishing is by having nets with holes in that catch adult fish but are big enough to let the little ones out. If young fish aren't caught, then they go on to breed. So there we go. I hope you found that helpful. Leave a like if you did. Click on a card and it'll take you to the playlist for all 6 papers. Once you've done the exam, come back here and tell us all how you did. We'd love to know. Good luck.